The first time I stood before her, I was nothing to her, less than nothing. The towering Zytherian queen sat upon a throne of black metal and bone, her 8-foot frame draped in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the pale light of her warship's council chamber. Her eyes, deep silver pools rimmed with glowing gold, looked down on me as though I was an insect she could crush between 2 fingers. A human, she'd scoffed in perfect standard. We do not breed with prey. Her voice was low, resonant, and filled with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you've ruled an empire longer than your opponent has been alive. I should have been afraid. Every other human who had stood in this chamber had been executed within minutes. But fear wasn't what I felt. It was something else, a quiet defiance. Then why am I still standing here? I'd asked. Her gaze had sharpened, but she didn't answer. The truth was, I'd been brought here as part of a political gambit. Earth was losing the war, and the Alliance Council had chosen me, Captain Elias Ward, to negotiate with the most feared leader in the galaxy. My orders were simple, buy us time. What I didn't know was that the Queen had her own orders, from her elders, to humiliate humanity by rejecting any diplomatic advances. What neither of us expected was that the negotiation wouldn't go the way anyone planned. For 3 days, I remained her guest in the palace chambers, a gilded cage high in the spire of her capital city on the volcanic world of Vaethra Prime. The air smelled faintly of ash and wild spice, and through my window, I could see rivers of molten rock cutting through the obsidian streets. Everywhere I went, Zytherian guards watched me with contempt. But the Queen, she was different. She would summon me to her private council hall not to talk politics, but to question me about humanity itself, our history, our myths, our strange insistence on protecting the weak. At first, she'd laugh at my answers, her voice echoing through the hall. "You speak of love as if it were a weapon," she'd say. "It is," I told her once. "The strongest one we have." She didn't laugh at that. I noticed then that her questions began to change, less about humanity's weaknesses and more about what drove us to survive against impossible odds. She'd lean forward on her throne, the black metal groaning under her weight, her silver eyes unblinking as I spoke. And when I told her about Earth's ancient wars, about leaders who had turned enemies into allies, her lips would press into something almost like thoughtfulness. One evening, if you could call it evening on a planet that never truly slept, she dismissed her guards. The chamber fell into silence, broken only by the low hum of the molten rivers outside. She stepped down from her throne, the heavy plates of her armor whispering against each other, and stood before me. The sheer height difference was staggering. My head barely reached her collarbone. Up close, I could see faint scars along her jawline, the mark of old battles. "You fight for your species," she said slowly, "even knowing you cannot win." "I fight," I answered, "because if I don't, we've already lost." Something flickered in her eyes, recognition maybe, or respect. She turned and walked to the balcony, staring out at the endless glow of her city. "My people see humans as fragile, weak. But you are not fragile." Her tone was quieter now, almost reluctant. "Perhaps there is strength in you I did not see." That night marked a shift. She still spoke with the same regal authority, but the mocking edge in her voice was gone. She began sharing pieces of her own history, how she had been crowned at barely 20 Zytherian years after defeating 3 rival claimants in single combat, how she had ruled through both famine and plague, how every choice she made was for the survival of her people. There were moments when I caught something in her expression, loneliness, buried deep under years of command. And maybe it was the same loneliness that kept me answering her summons, even when I knew every hour I stayed was another hour Earth waited for news that might never come. On the 7th day, the war reached her doorstep. A human strike fleet, desperate to force negotiations, entered Zytherian space. The palace alarms blared, red light flooding every hall. I expected her to have me thrown into a cell, but instead she came to me in the chaos, her voice sharp. "Come with me, human." She led me not to a prison, but to the command deck of her warship. The crew stared at me like I was a curse, but she ignored them. "You know your people's tactics better than anyone here," she said. "Tell me, how do I stop them without destroying them?" That was the first moment I realized she didn't want annihilation. She wanted understanding. Together, we planned a maneuver that disabled the fleet without killing a single human. And when the battle was over, and the Zytherian city still stood, she looked at me with something I never thought I'd see in her eyes, trust. It would be months before I understood where that trust would lead. For now, all I knew was that the Queen who once swore she'd never stand beside a human, now listened to one like an equal. And somewhere in the firelit shadows of her city, a story had begun that would change two civilizations forever. The auction floor was a pit of greed and hunger, rows of shadowed figures hunched forward in their seats, voices dripping with malice as they called out numbers to claim her. The alien queen stood tall despite the heavy collar biting into her neck, her 8-foot frame making her look like a living monument even in chains. Her long, silver-black hair fell over one shoulder, matted at the tips but still regal, framing a face carved in proud defiance. The deep emerald hue of her skin glimmered faintly under the harsh, yellowed lights, each flicker making her look less like a prisoner and more like a warrior goddess being paraded for their amusement. The auctioneer's voice cut like a whip, loud, fast, eager to drive the price higher. Lot 47, final chance for exclusive ownership rights to a pure-blood Xiran queen. Starting at... The number he said was obscene, enough to buy a small cargo freighter, yet hands still shot up across the room. They wanted her for power, for breeding, for their own twisted trophies. I clenched my jaw, watching her eyes. She didn't look at them, only at the far wall, as if their faces weren't even worth her notice. I raised my paddle when the number passed a threshold that made half the bidders flinch. A ripple went through the crowd, whispers, quick glances at the human foolish enough to throw that kind of money around here. Another bidder, a hulking, insectoid merchant lord, slammed his own paddle up, mandibles clicking with irritation. The numbers climbed. My pulse thudded in my ears as I called each bid without hesitation. She glanced at me once, just a flicker of her eyes, cool and unreadable. Then the merchant growled a number so high the room hushed. It was a threat as much as a bid. I didn't even blink before topping it. Gasps. A low hiss from somewhere behind me. And then silence. The merchant sat back, his many eyes narrowing in a silent promise. The auctioneer's mallet slammed down. Sold to the human. I didn't smile. I could feel the weight of the stairs on my back as I walked to the platform to sign the claim. The chains were released, the collar deactivated with a low buzz. For a moment she stood without moving, free yet not free, before stepping down beside me. The scent of her was faint but strange, like the cold air before a storm. Her expression never changed as the guards handed me the control key for her restraints. We walked together toward the side exit, her long stride effortlessly keeping pace. She didn't speak, only glanced at the crowd as they parted for us, some sneering openly, others whispering to each other in sharp, alien tongues. My chest tightened at the venom in their stares. Every instinct told me this wasn't over. In the corridor beyond, the noise of the auction faded, replaced by the echo of our footsteps. I risked a glance at her. "We're leaving this place," I said quietly. She didn't respond, but her shoulders had eased, just slightly, as if some invisible weight had shifted. Down the loading ramp, I guided her toward my ship. The air outside was sharp with the tang of ozone and engine exhaust. Lights from the docking bays flickered against the metal walls, and shadows moved where crews loaded cargo. She paused once, looking up at the expanse of sky between the buildings, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of distant stars. For the first time, her lips parted, as if to say something, but she closed them again, following me without protest. I had just reached the docking hatch when the air changed, thicker, heavier. A shadow blocked the light. I turned, and there he was, the insectoid merchant. Clothes now far taller than I had realized, his armor-like exoskeleton gleaming black under the bay lights. Two of his guards flanked him, hands on their weapons. His voice was a deep, clicking growl. "You paid much for what is not yours to keep." My hand tightened on the key at my belt. Around us, the dockworkers had gone quiet, watching. The queen stood beside me, her expression unreadable, but her gaze was fixed on him. I could feel her tension, coiled, dangerous, like a bowstring drawn to breaking. The merchant's eyes locked on me. "I offer you a chance to walk away, human. Leave her. You will live longer." My mind ran through every possible outcome, and none of them ended without blood. The dock's lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a warning siren wailed. My thumb brushed the hatch control behind me. "She's leaving with me," I said. The words sounded calm, too calm for the weight behind them. The merchant tilted his head, his mandibles flexing. Then slowly his gaze slid to her. She met it without flinching, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't before. Not fear, not defiance, something sharper. She shifted her stance, not enough for the guards to notice, but enough for me to realize she was ready to move. The merchant stepped closer. My hand hovered near my sidearm. The dock was still as stone. And then, One of the guard's hands twitched toward his weapon. The warehouse was silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint clink of metal as I knelt in front of her. Her wrists were raw where the shackles had bitten into skin, the faint blue of her veins standing out against the bruises. The key turned with a reluctant click, like the chains themselves didn't want to let go. Her hands fell into her lap, trembling, but she didn't pull them away when I reached out and rubbed warmth back into her fingers. She was still wary, her eyes darting between me and the nearest shadows, but there was a shift. Not trust. Not yet. Just curiosity. I opened the old satchel I'd brought and pulled out a folded bundle of fabric. Not rags like the auctioneers had wrapped her in, but soft, clean clothes, an oversized gray sweater and a pair of loose drawstring pants. "For you," I said, keeping my voice low like we were in a church. She didn't move at first, only staring as if the gesture itself was suspicious. But then she reached, slow and deliberate, her fingers brushing mine. Her skin was cool to the touch. While she changed behind a curtain of tarp, I turned away, not out of shame but respect. When she emerged, she looked smaller somehow, still regal in posture, but no longer an object displayed for sale. She held herself, arms crossing over her stomach, and sat down on the crate I'd pulled over. From the second bag I produced something else, a sealed ration pack. The moment I tore it open, and the scent of warm bread and spice stew hit the air, her head lifted sharply. Hunger broke through whatever mask she'd been wearing. She reached for the food with a flicker of desperation that told me she hadn't eaten in days. I let her take it without a word. The way she ate wasn't frantic, but there was intent in every bite, like she was storing each taste as proof she was still alive. It wasn't until she'd finished that she spoke. Just one word, quiet, her accent thick and strange. "Why?" I could have told her the truth, that something in her eyes had cut through me when I first saw her, that I'd never been able to stomach the idea of leaving someone like her in that place. But instead I said, "Because no one deserves chains." Her gaze lingered on me for a long time. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of the things she wasn't saying. Finally, she looked down at her hands and began to speak in fragments. Not everything made sense, not at first. Her people hadn't been born slaves, they'd been warriors. Hunters, guardians of something she never named. But the war had come, and with it fire that turned cities to glass. She'd fought, been captured, escaped, and been caught again. The marks on her arms weren't just from shackles, they were from battles, from blade and flame. She didn't tell me everything, but she told me enough to know she wasn't fragile. She wasn't some rescued pet to be sheltered from the world. She'd been broken, yes, but the edges were sharp, not soft. By the time the fire in the old barrel burned low, she was sitting closer. Not touching me, not yet, but close enough that I could feel the faint heat of her body. She studied me like one might study a strange weapon, unsure if it would save you or destroy you. When I finally stood and began packing up, she didn't resist. But she didn't follow either, not until I turned and held out my hand. There was a pause, a heartbeat of hesitation, then her fingers curled around mine. Her grip was surprisingly strong. We walked together through the empty streets, her steps quiet and precise, almost soundless. The city was sleeping, but danger wasn't gone. Every shadow could hold someone from that auction who wanted to reclaim what I'd taken. At the edge of the district, I stopped. She looked at me, puzzled, until I stepped behind her and unfastened the shock collar from her neck. It fell into my hand with a dull weight. She touched the bare skin there, as if relearning what freedom felt like. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again. "You freed me." I shook my head. "No, I just unlocked the door. What you do now, that's freedom." She didn't reply, but her expression changed. Not a smile, not exactly. More like the faint curve of someone who's decided something important in their heart. Her eyes were no longer just guarded, they were fierce. As we moved on, she walked half a step behind me, not because she feared me, but because she was watching. Scanning alleys. Tracking movement. I realized then, she wasn't just coming with me. She was guarding me too. By the time we reached my door, she stopped and glanced over her shoulder, as if measuring the distance between who she'd been and who she was now. I pushed the door open and stepped aside, letting her enter first. She hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold. And then, without looking back, she said in that quiet, certain voice, "From this day forward, we stand together."